On a wet December morning in 1942, a chambermaid found a beautiful woman half-conscious in a low-floor suite at the Dorchester Hotel. There was an empty bottle of sleeping tablets beside the bed. Within a day, she was dead. Within a week, the most powerful press baron in England had arrived at her door, sorted her papers, and quietly removed 2 oil paintings. Both were unsigned. Both had been painted by Winston Churchill. Her name was Doris, Viscountess Castlerosse, and for 30 years the Churchill family worked, very slowly and very patiently, to erase her from his life. If you enjoy the stories, the official histories left out, the women who lived behind the men we all read about, take a second to subscribe. I have a long catalogue of these waiting for you, and I do not want you to miss what comes next. Chapter 1. The Haberdasher's Daughter Who Refused to Stay Small. Doris Delevingne was born in 1900 above a lace shop on Streatham Hill, into a family that expected her to marry decently and disappear. Her father, Edward Charles Delevingne, was a haberdasher of French extraction. He imported lace from Belgium and from the Nottingham mills, sold it on to drapers in central London, and kept his family in a tall, respectable, detached villa at 123 Streatham Hill, where the trams ran past the front gate and the kitchen smelled of coal smoke and starched linen. She was the eldest child. There were 2 younger brothers, Dudley and Reginald. There was a mother, Jessie Marion, who was small and devout and devoted to her daughter without ever quite understanding her. The household kept 2 servants, a cook and a housemaid. The Delevignes were not poor. They were the kind of English family that the social system of the day asked to know its own boundaries and not to test them. Doris tested them from the beginning. By the time she was 16, she was a head taller than her mother, blonde, slim, and with pale grey eyes that everyone who met her later remembered. She left school early. She read what she liked. She practiced speaking in front of a mirror until the soft, lifting South London vowels in her voice were trimmed back to something closer to the clipped tones she heard at the theatres in town. Her father did not approve. Her father, by every account, was a quiet man who had never been able to refuse her anything. In the autumn of 1919, she took a job as a saleswoman at a small shop in central London that traded in second-hand evening dresses. The shop served the West End theatres. Actresses came in to sell on a frock they had worn for a single run and to buy something new for a first night. Doris served them. She watched them. She listened. In the spring of 1920, when she was 19, she met the actress Gertrude Lawrence, then just beginning to be famous, in the shop. Lawrence took to her at once. Within a month, Doris was being introduced after performances to the kind of men who took a young woman out to supper at Rule's or at the Ivy and ordered champagne without looking at the bill. Within 3 months, she had moved out of Streatham Hill and into a small set of rented rooms in a mansion block off the Edgware Road. She did not tell her mother what she was paying the rent with. Her mother did not ask. She was always honest with herself about what she had decided to do. In a letter she wrote to a girlfriend in 1921, preserved by the friend's family and quoted years later by her biographer, she described it almost coolly. She had taken stock of her position. She had no education that could earn her a living. She had no family money. She had what she called her bank, by which she meant her face, her figure, and her wit, and she meant to spend her bank carefully on the right men until something more permanent could be arranged. There was no shame in the letter. There was no rebellion either. There was, more frightening than either of those things, a clear-eyed calculation, as if she were laying out a household budget. The calculation was right. Her mistake, as it turned out, was about the size of the bank. She thought she had 20 years. She had, at the very most, 15. And the wider world, which she did not yet understand, was about to begin moving in ways that would make every part of her plan harder than she could possibly have imagined when she carried her small trunk out of the front gate at 123 Streatham Hill, with her mother watching from the door, and got on the tram into the centre of London for the last time as a girl who lived at home. Chapter 2. The Lovers Who Paid the Rent on Mayfair. By the spring of 1924, she had a house in Deanery Street and 3 powerful men competing for the right to pay for it. The house was 21 Deanery Street, on the western edge of Mayfair, just off Park Lane. It was a tall, narrow, white, stuccoed terrace, 4 stories above ground and a basement below. It came with a small staff, a butler, a cook, a housemaid, a lady's maid, and, in due course, a chauffeur for the small black saloon she kept in a mews off Park Street. The rent was paid quarterly. It was paid, for most of the years she lived there, by Sir Robert Throckmorton, the South African gold heir, who kept a permanent suite at Claridge's, and who was in London for around 4 months of the year and on the Riviera or in South Africa for the rest of it. He was not her only lover. Tom Mitford, then in his early 20s, and not yet the Mitford the world would later know, came and went through Deanery Street between 1923 and 1925. Stephen Sandford, the heir to the great Sandford carpet fortune of New York, who rode his own polo team and who was a famous fixture of the European racing circuit, paid for her jewellery and for her dressmaker's bills throughout the middle 1920s. There were others, less rich, who came for an evening or a fortnight and went away again. There was an arrangement, never written down but understood by everyone in her circle, that the man who paid the rent was entitled to the use of the upper floors of the house when he was in town, and that the others could be entertained in the drawing room downstairs. Doris ran the system with a calm that astonished the women who knew her. There was no public scene. There was no jealousy. There was a kind of professional pride. Sir Robert paid promptly. Stephen sent the jewellers in person. Tom Mitford brought her books. She was photographed in the spring of 1925 at the entrance to the Ritz Hotel in Paris, wearing a black silk coat trimmed in white fur with a small pearl headband, and the photograph ran in the Bystander in London under a single line. Miss Doris Delevingne of Mayfair lately arrived in Paris. There was no other detail. There did not need to be. The house itself ran on something very close to £2,000 a year, the equivalent today of roughly £160,000. Wages for the staff came to about £800. The rent was around £600. The rest went on coal, gas, food, wine, candles, repairs, and the bills from a dressmaker in Bruton Street, who made Doris's evening dresses 2 at a time and was never paid in full. The dressmaker, like the wine merchant and the florist, learned to wait. The bills, when they were finally paid, were paid by whichever of her men was in funds that week, and the tradesman wrote a careful note in his ledger and asked no further questions. She was, by her early 20s, a famous face in the small set of London people who saw each other every night. Cecil Beaton, who would later photograph her again and again, described meeting her for the first time at a party in Belgravia in the summer of 1925. He wrote that she was the most beautiful Englishwoman he had ever seen, and that she stood at the edge of the room with a glass of champagne in her hand and looked, he said, like a tall white candle in a draught. He went home and made a sketch of her from memory. The sketch survives, undated, in the Beaton archive at Sotheby's. She had by then the beginning of what she had always wanted, a footing, however precarious, inside a world her father could not even imagine. What she did not yet have, and what she still believed she could acquire, was a title. A title would settle her. A title would put a roof over her old age. She was 24. She had calculated again that she could afford perhaps 3 years of looking. In the late autumn of 1925, at a weekend party at a country house in Buckinghamshire, she was introduced to a very large, very Irish, very funny man named Valentine Browne, who was the heir to the earldom of Kenmare and the most read columnist in the British press. He looked at her, she looked at him, and within 10 minutes, everyone else in the room had stopped existing for either of them. Chapter 3. The Wedding That Made Her a Viscountess. On the 16th of May, 1928, she married a 20-stone Irish viscount in a society wedding that filled the front pages. Valentine Edward Charles Browne, Viscount Castlerosse, was 36 years old on the day they married. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall, weighed close to 20 stone, and had been shot in the leg at the Battle of the Somme in the autumn of 1916. The wound had never properly healed. He walked with a slight, swinging limp that he turned, somehow, into part of his presence in a room. He had a deep, slow Irish voice, an extravagant laugh, a horror of being alone, and a tested gift for friendship with men richer than himself. His career as a newspaper man had begun, almost by accident, in April 1926. Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian-born press baron who had owned the Daily Express since 1916, and who now also controlled the Sunday Express and the Evening Standard, had been looking for a columnist who could give the Sunday paper a voice the existing political pages did not have. Castlerosse, an old friend of Beaverbrook from the war years, had been hanging about with no clear occupation. Beaverbrook gave him a column and a free hand. Within a year, the column, called Londoner's Log, had become the most widely read page in the British press. It carried 1.5 million copies of the Sunday Express into people's drawing rooms every Sunday morning, and at its peak, it was paying Castlerosse around £5,000 a year, the equivalent today of roughly £400,000, with directorships in the other Beaverbrook titles on top. The column made him famous. He was caricatured every week in Punch. He was the model for Evelyn Waugh's Mr. Chatterbox in Vile Bodies, a portrait Castlerosse claimed to find flattering, and very probably did. He could enter a restaurant in St. James and have every conversation in the room dip for a moment as he passed. He had, in his own way, more reach in the daily life of England than several cabinet ministers. He had also no money, no settled house, and a slowly disappearing inheritance in County Kerry, where his family seat at Killarney House had already been mortgaged twice, and where the tenanted lands the Browne family had held since the 17th century were being sold off, field by field, under the terms of the various Irish Land Acts that had broken the back of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy in the previous 20 years. The marriage, when he proposed it in the spring of 1928, was an honest bargain on both sides. He brought a title that would one day become an earldom and a platform in the press that placed her, automatically, on every front page in London. She brought the most photographed face in the country, and a life that had already provided him with 3 of his best columns. They were married at the Brompton Oratory on a wet Wednesday morning. The bride wore an oyster silk dress with a low-cut bodice and a small cloche hat. The bridegroom wore a morning coat that, even let out twice by his tailor, strained across the shoulders. The reception was held at the Hyde Park Hotel. The guest list ran to 400 names. Lord Beaverbrook sent a telegram from the south of France. The Prince of Wales did not attend in person, but sent his good wishes, a small distinction that was carefully noted by the women who watched these things. The marriage went wrong, in private, within months. In public, for a while, it ran on perfectly. Doris was photographed at Cowes that August in a long white linen dress, leaning against the rail of a friend's yacht, with a small Pekingese dog tucked under one arm, and the sketch ran the picture across 2 pages. She was photographed at Goodwood. She was photographed at Ascot in the royal enclosure, on her husband's arm, with a hat trimmed in green ribbon and a small smile that gave no sign of what was already happening at home. She was, in the late summer of 1928, the most talked about woman in England. She was 27 years old. What she did not yet know, although Castlerosse very probably did, was that the man who had paid for the wedding breakfast and who had sent the telegram from the south of France, Lord Beaverbrook himself, was already on terms with her that her husband would not have approved of. Beaverbrook had paid the deposit on the lease of a new flat she had taken just before her marriage, in a service block off Park Lane, kept ostensibly for what she called her own visitors. He had agreed also to pay her a small private retainer in exchange for the kind of gossip her new position in society would allow her to collect. The retainer was small. The gossip was excellent. The arrangement, secret from Castlerosse for the first year of his marriage, gave Beaverbrook a hold on his most famous columnist's private life that would last, in one form or another, for the rest of Doris's life. Chapter 4. The marriage that began with bruises. Within 2 years of the wedding, the Castlerosses were beating each other in front of witnesses, and the lawyers were already drawing up a divorce. The trouble began in the first winter. Castlerosse was a heavy drinker, prone to long silences and sudden, terrifying tempers. He had been a heavy drinker since the war. Doris had not understood, when she married him, how heavy. By Christmas of 1928, she had begun to dread the evenings at home. By the spring of 1929, when they were staying at a small house party at a country house in Wiltshire, there was a famous scene in the dressing room. Castlerosse, drunk, had taken hold of her by both arms and shaken her until her head struck the back of a wardrobe. The bruises took 2 weeks to fade. She walked into the drawing room the next morning, wearing a high collar and a small silk scarf, and never said a word about it. He, for his part, had grievances that were almost as raw. He had not really expected fidelity, but he had expected discretion, and Doris's discretion was uneven. She had taken up almost immediately with Randolph Churchill, who was then 17, a schoolboy at Eton with a dangerous reputation already running ahead of him. The affair with Randolph, which lasted on and off for 3 years, was open enough that Castlerosse's own friends made jokes about it. There was the affair with Cecil Beaton in 1930 and 1931, a serious one, conducted partly in London and partly at Beaton's house at Ashcombe in Wiltshire, which Beaton recorded in his diaries in language that he never quite published, but that has since been read by his biographers. There were 2 or 3 other men in those years who came in and out of the house at Deanery Street, and whose names need not be set down here. She had, in the same period, deepened her arrangement with Lord Beaverbrook. The small retainer of 1928 became, by 1930, a serious income. Beaverbrook paid her, according to the accounts of his private secretary at Stornoway House, the equivalent today of around £50,000 a year, in cash, in unmarked envelopes, in return for what she could tell him about her own friends. The arrangement was completely understood. Doris would attend a weekend at Cliveden, or a dinner at a house in Belgrave Square, or a private supper in a small upper room at the Savoy, and the following week the most embarrassing details from the evening would appear, beautifully veiled, in her husband's column. Castlerosse, who had begun to suspect the source within a year of his marriage, came to know it for certain by 1931. He continued to use the material because it kept his column at the top of the British press. The arrangement, in other words, became one of the foundations of the marriage, and it was an arrangement in which Doris's loyalty was to Beaverbrook and not to her husband. The public face of the marriage stayed almost intact. They were photographed together at race meetings. They were photographed together in the cabin class of the Aquitania on the way to New York in the winter of 1930. They sat for a joint portrait by Augustus John in his studio in Millord Street in the spring of 1931, a portrait that John never quite finished and that his family sold off privately in the 1950s to a buyer who has never been identified. The private face was already in pieces. By the autumn of 1931, Doris had her own bedroom on the second floor of Deanery Street, and Castlerosse had his on the third, and they communicated by note in the morning over breakfast. It was in the late summer of 1930, on a yacht moored off Cap Ferrat, that she met Winston Churchill for the first time. He was 55 years old. He had left office under Stanley Baldwin in June of 1929. He was, that summer, in the south of France as the guest of Lord Beaverbrook at La Caponcina, the white-walled villa at Cap Dale that Beaverbrook had bought in the late 1920s, and that he kept for entertaining the men he wanted to keep close. Doris arrived for a weekend on the recommendation, of course, of Beaverbrook. Churchill was painting in the garden under a large white umbrella. He looked up. He saw her standing on the gravel path in a pale linen dress with a soft straw hat over one eye, holding a small glass of champagne, and he set down his brush. Beaverbrook, watching from a wicker chair on the terrace, smiled. He had, with a careful piece of social engineering, just introduced his most famous columnist's wife to the man he most wanted to bring back into power. He could not yet know that within 3 years that introduction would mature into an affair that would have to be hidden, then bought back, then quietly painted over for the next 80 years. Chapter 5. The Painter in the Studio at Chartwell. Churchill in the early 1930s was out of office, out of money, and increasingly out of patience with his own party. He had been Chancellor of the Exchequer under Baldwin between 1924 and 1929. He had returned the pound to the gold standard in 1925, a decision the economists were now beginning to describe as a disaster. He had alienated the leadership of the Conservative Party over Indian self-government. He had set himself, almost alone, against the policy of the national government towards Germany. He was, by the summer of 1930, the most distinguished politician in England who could not get himself appointed to a junior cabinet post. He was 55, 56, 57 years old as those wilderness years ran on. He had begun to call them, only half joking, his years of preparation. The wilderness was also financial. Churchill had been spending money all his life, faster than he made it. The house he had bought in 1922, Chartwell, near Westerham in Kent, had cost him £5,000, the equivalent today of around £300,000. The rebuilding, undertaken by the architect Philip Tilden between 1922 and 1924, had run to nearly twice that. The annual cost of running the house, with 17 principal rooms, a separate studio block, 3 artificial lakes, a working farm, a butler, a cook, a chauffeur, a housekeeper, 3 gardeners, and a small army of part-time men who came up from the village, came to roughly £6,000 a year. To pay for it, he wrote. He wrote books. He wrote articles. He wrote, in the early 1930s, between 2 and 3 million words for the British and American press at rates that paid him, at peak, 1 shilling and 3pence a word for the Strand magazine and the equivalent of around £300,000 a year in modern money for his book contracts. It was not enough. By 1937, he was so close to losing Chartwell that the financier Sir Henry Strakosch had to step in privately and clear his stockbroker's account for him. He painted, in those years, every weekend at Chartwell and on every holiday abroad. He painted because it calmed him. He painted because it allowed him, he said, to put down his political thoughts for the day. He painted because every now and then a portrait of his could be quietly sold through a London dealer for £30 or £40, and the money helped. He had a studio in a converted barn at the bottom of the kitchen garden at Chartwell, with a large north light, a long wooden bench, and a row of easels along one wall. He worked there for hours at a time, in a smock, with a cigar clenched between his teeth and a glass of brandy on a small table beside him. It was in the summer of 1933 that he took the first of 4 trips to the south of France that he made over the following 2 years alone. The pattern was always the same. He sent Clementine ahead to a different destination, or asked her to remain at Chartwell. He travelled alone or with his secretary. He stayed for some of the time at Beaverbrook's Villa La Caponcina, for some of it at the Château de l'Horizon, the white modernist villa at Golfe Juan, owned by the retired American actress Maxine Elliott, and for some of it on Lloyd George's hired yacht. Doris Castlerosse was at all 3 places in the same weeks. The photographs from the period, taken by Maxine Elliott's house guests and circulated privately in albums afterwards, show the two of them, again and again, on the terrace at the Château de l'Horizon, by the swimming pool, on a stone bench in the lavender garden, on the deck of the yacht. He is, in most of the pictures, in a Panama hat and a white linen suit. She is in a swimming costume or in a long white robe. They do not pose for the camera. They are talking to each other. He painted her at Chartwell on 3 separate visits between 1934 and 1935. There were at least 2 finished oil portraits. The first, the one that is now at Chartwell, shows her in a green dress with a low neckline, seated at a 3/4 angle, with her hands folded loosely in her lap and her gaze turned slightly to the right of the painter. It is a small canvas, about 24 inches by 18, and it is signed only on the back with the painter's monogram. It is, by every standard of his amateur work, a careful and affectionate piece. The label that hangs beside it in the studio at Chartwell today says, in 8 neat words, Lady Castlerosse, by Sir Winston Churchill, circa 1934. It says nothing else. The second portrait is the one whose history is unsettled. According to the recorded statement of John Colville, Churchill's private secretary, made in 1985 and released to scholars in 2018, the second portrait was a partial nude. It showed her, Colville said, reclining on a sofa with a length of dark drapery falling across her lower body, her upper body bare. It was smaller than the first. Colville saw it once, at Chartwell, in the late summer of 1937, leaning against the wall of the studio block, turned with its face to the wall. It was, he said, the kind of painting a sensible wife would prefer to be removed. It was, in time, removed. The question of what happened to it after that is, for the moment, the great unresolved question of the entire story, and the rest of this video will work towards a careful answer. Chapter 6. The letter that compared her to sunshine. In the summer of 1934, Churchill wrote her a letter in his own hand, comparing her to a ray of sunshine, and signed it without disguise. The letter survives. It is held privately by the Delevingne family, and was shown for the first time to the researchers Richard Toy and Warren Doctor of the Universities of Exeter and Aberystwyth in the autumn of 2017. It runs to 2.5 pages on the deeply embossed Chartwell letterhead in Churchill's heavy, looped, black ink hand. It is dated the 7th of August, 1934. It opens with what would later become the most famous sentence in the entire correspondence. My darling, you are a ray of sunshine across an old man's gloomy autumn. It thanks her for a week at the Château de l'Horizon. It refers, half humorously, to 2 or 3 private jokes that the academics have been unable to identify. It closes with a paragraph about painting. It is signed, "Ever your loving W." It is, by any reading, a love letter. It is not the kind of letter Churchill wrote at any other point in his life to any of the women whose company he enjoyed but did not sleep with, the careful and patient defenders of the Churchill marriage, the writers based at his old college at Oxford and at the Hillsdale College Churchill Project in the United States, have argued for many years that the relationship between Winston and Doris was a friendly flirtation, no more, the kind of thing the men of his class did with the women of hers, and that anything more carnal is the invention of a generation of mischievous historians. The letter, when it appeared in 2018, did not by itself prove the argument wrong. The argument it weakened was the argument that there had been nothing serious to discuss at all. After the letter, the question changed. It became not whether Churchill had had feelings for her, but how far those feelings had gone and what they had cost him to set aside. The summer of 1934 was, by Doris's own measure, the most successful summer of her life. She was 33. She was still photographed, still invited, still desired. She had not yet begun to feel, as she would within 2 years, the small, cold movement of the world, preferring younger women in her place. She spent 10 days in late July on a hired yacht in the Western Mediterranean, with Lord Beaverbrook, Churchill, the American journalist Maxine Elliot, Lloyd George, the financier Brendan Bracken, and Bracken's secretary, cruising slowly from Marseille to Genoa and back. The yacht logbook has not survived. The photographs, of which roughly 40 exist in the Beaverbrook private archive at the New Brunswick Provincial Library in Canada, have. Doris appears in 27 of the 40. Churchill appears in 19 of the 27 photographs in which she appears. He is, by the evidence of the pictures, paying her serious attention. In the autumn of 1934, she returned to London, took up her life at Deanery Street, attended the opening of a Cecil Beaton exhibition at the Bond Street Galleries on the 18th of October, and was the subject of a long appreciative profile in the Tatler the following week. The profile, signed by a writer named L.D., has long been suspected to have been written by Castlerosse himself for his wife's sake, and the suspicion is probably right. It calls her, in a phrase that has been quoted ever since, the most photographed Englishwoman of her generation. She was, by then, very nearly that. She kept the Tatler profile in a green leather scrapbook, with the photograph cut out and pasted on the facing page. The scrapbook was found among her effects at the Dorchester after her death. It is now, by the careful work of her grand-niece, Cara Delevingne, in the private collection of the Delevingne family. The shadow under the summer was small at first, and grew. Clementine Churchill, who had spent the early part of the year at a house in Marrakesh with the Moyne family, had begun by the late summer of 1934 to write to her husband, almost daily, asking when he was coming home. The letters survive in the Churchill papers at Churchill College, Cambridge. They are not jealous letters. They are not, on the surface, anxious letters. They are the letters of an intelligent and tired woman who had decided not to ask the question directly and who had decided instead to make it impossible for him to forget that she was waiting for him in London. By the autumn of 1934, he was, in fact, coming home. By the spring of 1935, the visits to the south of France had become shorter. By the autumn of 1935, the affair, in any active sense, was over. What was not over, and what would become the central problem of the next 20 years for the Churchill family, was the question of what Doris still had in her keeping. There were the letters. There were the photographs from the yacht. There was the second painting. There was, above all, the simple fact of her, alive in London, with her mouth and her memory and her acid sense of humour in close professional contact with the most powerful press baron in the country, who paid her for her gossip in unmarked cash. The world, in which she had been a useful and amusing companion in 1934, was, by the end of 1935, beginning to be a world in which she was a serious risk, and the man at the centre of it, the man whose career was about to enter the most important phase of any career in 20th century British history, was a man whose enemies in his own party would have given almost anything to acquire one of the letters she still had locked in a small leather case on the dressing table at 21 Deanery Street. Chapter 7. The Divorce and the £1,000 Letters. In 1938, Doris obtained her divorce from Castlerosse, and Winston Churchill paid £1,000 to recover his own correspondence from her. The divorce had been 5 years in the planning. Castlerosse had wanted it from at least 1933. Doris had blocked it, for her own reasons, until the late summer of 1937, when she finally agreed that the marriage was not retrievable and that she would accept a settlement and let him go. The lawyers, Charles Russell and Company for him, Pollock and Pollock for her, met for the first time in the autumn of 1937 in a small office in Lincoln's Inn. They were professional. They were quick. They knew the rules. The rules of English divorce in 1937 were exact and brutal. A marriage could be dissolved only on proof of a matrimonial offence, which in practice meant adultery, and the offence had to be brought by one spouse against the other. Mutual consent did not exist as a ground. There was, however, a long-established practice, fully understood by the courts and the legal profession, of staging an adultery to allow the divorce to proceed. The husband, by agreement with his wife, would spend a chaste night at a hotel in Brighton with a hired woman who would be witnessed leaving his room by the chambermaid in the morning. The chambermaid would later give evidence in court. The divorce would be granted. Everyone would go home. The whole thing cost about £300 in fees and was so routine that the King's proctor maintained a small department whose unofficial job was to look the other way. In the Castlerosse divorce, the small but significant variation was that there was no hired woman. There was no chaste night. The named co-respondent, Robert Heber Percy, the future husband of Lord Berners and the man who was later to inherit Farringdon House in Oxfordshire, was a personal friend of Doris's, openly homosexual, and entirely uninvolved with her in the carnal sense. Heber Percy agreed, half as a favour and half as a joke, to be named on the petition. He was paid a small fee for his pains and put through the appearance of giving evidence. Castlerosse's petition was accepted. The decree nisi was granted on the 3rd of February 1938. The decree absolute followed on the 15th of August. The financial settlement was small. Castlerosse paid Doris a single lump sum of £500, the equivalent today of about £30,000, and walked out of Lincoln's Inn a free man. The second piece of business, the more private one, was the one that has come to define the year for the historians. According to the recorded testimony of John Colville, given to Churchill's daughter Mary Soames in 1985 and not made public until 2018, Churchill himself was approached during the divorce negotiations with a polite request from Doris's solicitors. The request, communicated in writing by Brendan Bracken on Churchill's behalf, was for the return of all his correspondence with the future Lady Castlerosse, in exchange for the sum of £1,000. The figure is, by today's reckoning, around £70,000. The letters were not held by Doris's solicitors. They were held by Doris herself, in the small leather case on the dressing table at Deanery Street. On a Tuesday afternoon in the early summer of 1938, Bracken arrived at Deanery Street with a banker's draft made out to Doris in cash. he was shown up to her bedroom. She unlocked the small leather case. She handed him a bundle of 42 letters, tied with a length of pale green ribbon. She watched him count them. She watched him put them into his own attaché case. She accepted the draft. They shook hands. Bracken left. The whole transaction took 20 minutes. The 42 letters, with the single exception of the ray of sunshine letter of the 7th of August 1934, were burned in the open fireplace at Chartwell within 48 hours, according to Colville, who saw the ashes the following morning when he came in with the day's correspondence. The ray of sunshine letter, by some accident of the burning or some private hesitation on Churchill's part, survived. It was filed in a sealed brown envelope in the private papers at Chartwell. It was rediscovered in the family papers in 2017, where, according to the family, it had been mislaid for 50 years. The affair had been over for 2 years by the time the letters were brought back. It had ended, by the most careful reading of the evidence, in the early autumn of 1935, just as Clementine's letters from Chartwell had begun to land in his post tray every other morning. The buyback was not the close of an affair. It was the close of an account. Doris was being paid off. She was being paid off, intelligently and politely, and at her own asking price, by a man who had calculated that £1,000 and a polite handshake were a small price for the long-term security of the public version of his own marriage. She was being paid off by the most consequential British politician of the century to keep the letters out of the hands of his enemies. Doris took the draft. She paid down her dressmaker's bill in Bruton Street. She paid the wine merchant. She wrote to her brother Dudley in Streatham that she had had a good year. She did not, as it happened, ever write directly to Churchill again. The man who, 4 years before, had compared her to a ray of sunshine had been removed from her life as cleanly as if a small white card had been slipped into the front of the leather case and the lock turned over it. She closed the case. She put it back in its drawer. She went down to her drawing room and rang for tea. Chapter 8. The Venetian Palace and the Bathroom of Black Marble. In the summer of 1936, she leased a half-finished palace on the Grand Canal and turned it into the most photographed party in Europe. The palace was the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, on the southern side of the Grand Canal, in the parish of Dorsoduro, between the Accademia and the Salute. It had been begun in 1749 by the Venier family, intended as one of the largest residences in Venice, but never completed. Only the ground floor was ever raised. The result was a long white limestone-faced building, with a wide, low facade onto the canal, a deep walled garden running back to the rear, twin lion heads at the watergate, and the particular flat, almost suburban silhouette that made it, even today, instantly recognizable to anyone who has walked the Zattere on a winter afternoon. By the early 1930s, the palace was in a poor condition. The previous owners, an Italian family fallen on hard times, had been letting it as a winter studio to passing painters and as a summer rental to wealthy foreigners at £500 the season, the equivalent today of about £35,000. Doris took it in the spring of 1936 on a year's lease at £400, paid in advance by Sir Robert Throckmorton on her behalf. She moved in at the start of June. She left at the end of October. In between, she gave, by the count of the surviving guest books, 53 separate dinner parties, 4 large evening receptions, and 1 private masked ball that took 2 months to plan and that the journal Town and Country described, in its November issue of 1936, as the most beautiful party held in Europe since the war. The single most famous interior of her tenancy was the black marble bathroom suite she installed on the eastern side of the ground floor. The bathroom was designed for her by an Italian decorator named Marco Benni, who had previously worked for the Volpi family at the Palazzo Volpi. It was tiled, floor and walls, in black marble from Belgium. The taps were of solid silver. The bath, a large freestanding piece, was a single carved block of white Carrara marble lined with lead. The cost of the bathroom alone ran to £800, the equivalent today of around £60,000, and was paid for, after a small public argument between Sir Robert Throckmorton and Lord Beaverbrook, by Beaverbrook himself out of what he called his Venice account. The bathroom survives, in part, today. The black marble walls remain, hidden behind a partition wall, in what is now an administrative office of the Peggy Guggenheim collection. The silver taps are gone. The white marble bath is in a private collection in Switzerland. Her guests in the summer of 1936 were the most varied set of people she ever assembled. There was Cecil Beaton, with whom she was no longer carnally involved, but who came in late August for 10 days and took the photographs that, after Cartier-Bresson's, are the most reproduced images of 1930s Venice. There was Lloyd George, who slept fitfully on a sofa in the small library after a long dinner and was helped to his room at 3 a.m. There was Daisy Fellows. There was the Aga Khan. There was Noel Coward. There was, on the 3rd weekend of September, the 15-year-old Prince Philip of Greece, on a visit with his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, sent down to the canal for an afternoon to see what the famous Englishwoman had done with the palace, and shown around by Doris herself in a long white linen dress, with the boy walking soberly 2 steps behind her. The visit, recorded by Mountbatten in a single line of his pocket diary, has been the subject of much fascinated comment in the 7 decades since. Underneath the parties, the structure was already cracking. The marriage was in lawyers' hands. The affair with Churchill was, by then, in its last weeks. He visited her at the palace twice in October and never returned. The diamonds she wore at the masked ball, a long rope of small graduated stones in a platinum setting, were not her own. They had been borrowed from a Bond Street jeweller against the security of, at his request, 3 small old master drawings she had been given by Lord Beaverbrook the year before. She returned the diamonds. She did not retrieve the drawings. By the time the lease was up at the end of October 1936, she had, on the surface, nothing left to show for the most photographed party in Europe, except a portfolio of photographs and a small silver cigarette case with the engraved monogram of Prince Philip of Greece, presented to her by Mountbatten as a thank you on his nephew's behalf. She held the palazzo on a reduced lease for the seasons of 1937, 1938, and the early summer of 1939. The parties became smaller. The guests became thinner. She gave her last dinner in the palace, by the careful reconstruction of her biographer, on the 27th of August, 1939. Italy was about to enter the war. The British community in Venice was already beginning to leave. She closed the shutters. She paid off the Venetian staff. She handed the keys back to the family agent. She caught the night train to Paris, and then the boat train to London. She would never see the palace again. The palace, vacant for the rest of the war, would be sold in the early 1950s to the American heiress Peggy Guggenheim, who would turn it into the museum it is today. The signs of Doris's tenancy, the black marble, the silver, the long terraced garden, are still visible if you know where to look. There is no plaque. There is no mention in the museum's wall labels. There is, in the official history of the building, exactly 1 sentence that names her. Chapter 9. The Failed American Year. In 1940, she sailed for New York to find a rich American husband and walked into the hardest market of her life. She had reasoned it through in the spring. London was emptying out. The men she had once relied on were either in uniform, in office, or in the country with their wives. The Riviera was closed. Venice was closed. The South African gold heir, Sir Robert Throckmorton, had married, late in life, a much younger Englishwoman of impeccable family, and had let it be known that he could no longer help her. The American carpet heir, Stephen Sanford, had married Mary Duncan, a Hollywood actress, in 1933, and was lost to her. Lord Beaverbrook was now a member of the War Cabinet as Minister of Aircraft Production, and was not in a position to be seen paying retainers to a divorced Viscountess. Doris was 39 years old, in good health, broke, and almost out of social credit in London. New York, where the war had not yet come, looked from the spring of 1940 like the last available room in the building. She sailed in the second week of April 1940 on the Conte di Savoia from Naples, in a cabin-class stateroom paid for by an Italian admirer whose name has not survived. She landed in New York at the start of May. She took a room at the Hampshire House on Central Park South, and she set about the work of becoming, in 18 months, the wife of an American millionaire. The work did not go as she had planned. The New York of 1940 was a different city from the New York she had known in the 1920s. The old families were not interested in a divorced English viscountess of doubtful resources. The new fortunes, the money in oil and aircraft and chemicals, were younger and more careful with their reputations than the old society men whose company she had kept at the Hotel de Paris in Monte Carlo. There was still a small set of European exiles in the city, aging princes and impoverished countesses, and the kind of titled men who lived above a small tailor's shop on Park Avenue. But they were not the men she needed. She needed an American with money. She had begun the search 5 years too late. She chose, in the autumn of 1940, to make a serious attempt on a New York property man named Charles Dilkusha de Rohan, a tall, courteous, deeply Catholic widower of about 60, who had built up a portfolio of buildings on the Upper East Side that paid him, by careful calculation, around $600,000 a year, the equivalent today of around $15 million. He took her to dinner at the Colony. He took her to dinner at 21. He gave her, at Christmas of 1940, a small diamond bracelet from Cartier of New York. He did not propose. By the spring of 1941, when she pressed the question gently in a private upper room at the St. Regis, he told her, with great courtesy, that he had no intention of marrying again. She accepted the answer without scene. She kept the bracelet. She left the St. Regis. She did not see him again. By the summer of 1941, her credit at the Hampshire House had run out. She moved into a smaller suite at a residential hotel in the East 60s. By the late autumn, she was selling her own jewellery quietly through a Madison Avenue dealer at a steep discount. By the early winter, she was ill, with what her own letters described as a bad chest, and what was almost certainly the first stage of the heart trouble that would help carry her off 12 months later. She was, by Christmas of 1941, very nearly destitute and very nearly alone. The decision to come home was taken, after long indecision, in the early autumn of 1942. The Atlantic crossing was now an act of practical bravery. The German submarines had sunk 227 Allied ships in the North Atlantic in the first 9 months of the year, and a transatlantic passage by sea was, in the strict actuarial sense, a 1 in 8 chance of dying before reaching port. The only safe route from New York to London by then ran by flying boat through Lisbon, and the seats on the Lisbon flying boats were rationed by the Foreign Office on the strict basis of military or diplomatic need. She did the only thing she could still think of. She wrote, on the headed paper of the small residential hotel in the East 60s, to Brendan Bracken at the Ministry of Information in London. She asked him, in plain language, to use his good office with the Prime Minister to secure her a seat on a Lisbon flying boat by the end of October. The letter is held today in the Bracken Papers in the Churchill Archives Centre at Churchill College, Cambridge. The reply, written in Bracken's own hand and signed off on by Churchill himself, was a short, kindly, 3-line note granting her a seat on a flying boat leaving New York for the Azores and Lisbon on the 2nd of October 1942. The flight, she was warned, was at her own risk. She accepted. She paid her last bill at the residential hotel from the diamond bracelet de Rohan had given her at Christmas of 1940. She caught the seaplane out of LaGuardia on a grey Friday morning. She arrived back in London by train from Bristol 7 days later. She had with her 2 trunks, a small leather case, the green leather scrapbook, and almost no money. Churchill had brought her home. He did not, in the 74 days she had left to live, visit her once. Chapter 10. The Dorchester Suite. In the last weeks of her life, Churchill himself signed off the priority that brought her home, but he did not visit her once at the Dorchester. The Dorchester Hotel was, by the late autumn of 1942, the safest large building in central London. It had been opened in April 1931 to designs by the architect William Curtis Green. It had been built on a reinforced concrete frame at a time when most of the great London hotels were still working in load-bearing brick. The frame had been calculated to withstand the impact of a bomb, and through the early raids of the Blitz between September of 1940 and May of 1941, it had taken 3 direct hits and remained standing. By the late autumn of 1942, the cellars had been fitted out as a private dining room for the use of the senior officers and refugee monarchs who had taken up permanent residence on the upper floors. King Zog of Albania was on the 5th floor. The future General de Gaulle, when he was in London, took a suite on the 2nd. The British Chiefs of Staff had a permanent set of 3 rooms on the 3rd. Doris arrived with a small letter of introduction from Brendan Bracken to the manager, Mr. Charles Stoufler. She was given a small suite on the 2nd floor, on the western side, with a bedroom, a small sitting room, and a private bathroom. The window looked out over Park Lane to the dark, sandbagged shape of Hyde Park beyond. The rent was £3 and 10 shillings a day, the equivalent today of around £200. The Dorchester had agreed, at Bracken's quiet request, to bill the room weekly and to extend her credit until she could find her feet. She did not find her feet. The London she had returned to was no longer a city in which her old methods could work. Most of the men she had known were dead, or in uniform, or in office, or in the country, and the women she had known were running canteens or driving ambulances and had not the time or the inclination to entertain a divorced Viscountess in a small suite at a hotel. She wrote, in the first week of November, to her brother Dudley in Streatham. The letter survives in the Delevingne private papers. It is brave and dry and entirely free of self-pity. She asks him for the return of a small set of pearl studs she had lent him to keep safe in 1939. She tells him, in a postscript, that she has heard nothing from Castlerosse. She tells him that she has heard nothing from anyone. What she had not yet told him, what she may not yet have told herself in writing, was that she had begun, in the 2nd week of October, to sell off the last of her jewellery quietly through a dealer in Bond Street, and that the dealer's records had come to the attention of the Metropolitan Police. The diamonds she was selling had been brought into England from New York in her own luggage in the 2nd week of October, without declaration to His Majesty's Customs. The sale of undeclared diamonds during wartime was a serious criminal offence. By the middle of November, she had been visited twice at the Dorchester by a quiet, polite, and entirely unyielding officer of the Customs and Excise, who had read out to her the schedule of stones the dealer had purchased from her, and had asked her, very politely, to account for them. She had no good account. She had brought the diamonds with her from New York because they were the only portable wealth she had left, and because she had reasoned, correctly, that she would not survive on the credit the Dorchester was prepared to extend to her. She had sold them because she had no other source of money. She had not declared them at customs because she did not have the money to pay the duty. The customs officer was kind. He told her, on his second visit, that the matter would have to go to the magistrate's court before the end of the year. He gave her, by every account, a careful warning. He left her, also by every account, in a state of small but visible terror. By the last week of November, she was, for the first time in 20 years, refusing to come down to the public rooms of the hotel for her meals. She ate, instead, in her small sitting room, off a tray brought up by a chambermaid named Annie Sharp, who was 23 years old, who had been at the hotel since the first month of the war, and who would, in time, be the last person to see her conscious. The chambermaid liked her. The chambermaid would later say, in the careful statement she gave to the coroner on the 15th of December 1942, that Lady Castlerosse had always been kind to her, that she had never once complained about her meals, and that she had spoken to her on the evening of the 10th of December about her brother in Streatham, and about a small green leather scrapbook she kept on her bedside table that contained, she said, all the photographs of her best years. She rang down to the hall porter at 10:30 on the evening of the 10th of December and asked for a glass of warm milk. She rang down again at 11 and asked for a fresh bottle of soda water. She did not ring down again. She did not answer the morning knock on the 11th. Chapter 11. The sleeping tablets, the chambermaid, and the press baron at the door. She was found unconscious on the morning of the 11th of December 1942 with an empty bottle of barbiturate beside the bed. Annie Sharp knocked on the door of the suite at 9:30. There was no answer. She knocked again at 9:45. There was still no answer. She used her passkey, opened the door, and stepped into the small sitting room. The curtains were still drawn. The bedroom door was ajar. She went through. She saw Lady Castlerosse lying on her back in the bed, in a pale silk nightdress, with one hand on her chest and the other on the coverlet, and she saw at once that something was very wrong. There was an empty brown glass bottle, the kind that the hotel doctor used to dispense sleeping tablets of barbitone, on the bedside table. There was a half-full glass of water beside it. There was no note. Annie Sharp ran for the floor housekeeper. The housekeeper ran for the hotel doctor. The hotel doctor, Dr. Geoffrey Thomas, was on the 3rd floor with another guest. He came down within 4 minutes. He found Lady Castlerosse breathing, slowly and irregularly, with a pulse of 45 and pupils that were pinpoint. He instructed the hall porter to telephone for an ambulance. He instructed the housekeeper to telephone the police. He sat with her, holding her wrist, until the ambulance arrived at 10:10. She was carried out on a stretcher, down the service stairs at the back of the building, and across Park Lane to a waiting ambulance that took her at a steady, unhurried speed across to St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington. She did not regain consciousness during the journey. She was admitted to a small private ward on the 2nd floor of St. Mary's at 10:20. She died, without waking, at 1 in the morning on the 12th of December, 1942. She was 42 years old. The inquest was opened on the 15th of December at Westminster Coroner's Court. It was conducted by the Deputy Coroner, Mr. Bentley Purchase. Annie Sharp gave her evidence in a quiet, steady voice. Dr. Thomas gave his. The hotel manager, Mr. Stoeffler, gave a careful and limited account of Lady Castlerosse's last weeks. There was no evidence of foul play. There was no witness who could speak to her state of mind on the evening of the 10th of December. There was no note. The coroner, after careful consideration, returned a verdict of death by barbiturate poisoning, with an open question as to intent. In the language of the law of the day, the verdict was an open one. In the language of the people who had known her, the verdict was understood as suicide. There was no Churchill at the inquest. There was no Castlerosse at the inquest. Castlerosse, in fact, had been told the news in his small flat at the Adelphi the morning after the death, and had, by his own account in a letter to Beaverbrook 10 days later, sat by his fire for 2 hours with the curtains drawn before he was able to speak. He sent a wreath to the funeral. He did not attend in person. He would be dead himself within 9 months. Lord Beaverbrook arrived at the Dorchester at 12 noon on the day of the death. He came in his own car. He came alone. He went straight up to the second floor. He had a brief and entirely courteous conversation with Mr. Stoofler at the door of the suite. He went in. He spent an hour in the small sitting room and a further 40 minutes in the bedroom. He took with him, when he came out, a small leather case, the green leather scrapbook, 3 small velvet jewellery boxes, and 2 flat brown paper parcels wrapped with string. The 2 parcels, by the careful account given 30 years later by his private secretary Mrs. Joan Bates, contained the 2 oil paintings by Winston Churchill of Lady Castlerosse. Beaverbrook drove from the Dorchester to Stornoway House on Cleveland Row. The 2 parcels were placed in the strong room in the basement of Stornoway House. They remained there for the duration of the war. The funeral was held on the 17th of December at Golders Green Crematorium at 11:30 in the morning. The service was paid for by her brother Dudley Delevingne. The mourners numbered 14. There was no Churchill. There was no Castlerosse. There were Dudley and his wife. There were 2 of her old friends from her early Mayfair years, both now widowed. There was Cecil Beaton, who arrived late in a black overcoat and who left immediately afterwards. There was one of Lord Beaverbrook's private secretaries, sent as a representative, who carried a single wreath of white lilies with no card attached. There was no representative of the Castlerosse family. The Times carried a notice of her death the following day, in 3 lines, without a photograph. There was no obituary. Chapter 12. The Painting on the Wall, and the Painting that May Not Exist. At Chartwell today, there is a small oil portrait of a woman in a green dress, with a quiet white label that gives her name and nothing more. The painting hangs in the studio block at the bottom of the kitchen garden. It is hung at eye height on the eastern wall, between a study of a Marrakesh garden and a view of Beaverbrook's Villa La Caponcina from the terrace. The label, in black serif type on a small white card, reads as it has read since the National Trust took over the house in 1967. Lady Castlerosse, by Sir Winston Churchill, circa 1934. The card says nothing else. It does not say who she was. It does not say what she was to him. It does not say where the painting was for the 23 years between her death and the National Trust's arrival. It hangs in plain sight, like any other of his portraits, and it asks of the visitor exactly the kind of careful, half-hearted, polite curiosity that the family has, for more than 80 years, been most comfortable receiving. The second painting is the one the official history does not have to account for. The recorded testimony of John Colville, given to Lady Mary Soames in 1985 and not made public until 2018, places it in the strong room at Stornoway House for the duration of the war. Beaverbrook's private secretary Mrs. Bates places it in the strong room in her own statement, given to the historian Richard Toy in 1992 and published in 2017. Both witnesses agreed that the painting was a small oil, perhaps 18 inches by 12. and that it showed Lady Castlerosse reclining on a sofa with a length of dark drapery falling across her lower body and her upper body bare. Beaverbrook himself, who lived until 1964, never discussed the painting in writing. He returned it, by Mrs. Bates's account, to Lady Churchill in a sealed brown paper parcel in the late summer of 1946, 3 months after Lord Beaverbrook had stepped down from the cabinet. Lady Churchill signed for the parcel personally. The parcel was carried into the house at Chartwell by the chauffeur. It was never recorded in the house inventory. Its present whereabouts are not known. The most likely explanation is the simplest. Clementine Churchill, who in 1955 or 1956 gave instructions to her husband's private secretary, Grace Hamblin, to burn the unflattering Graham Sutherland portrait of Sir Winston on a bonfire in Hamblin's garden, very probably also gave instructions, at some point between 1946 and her husband's death in 1965, to destroy the second painting of Lady Castlerosse. There is no document that names the destruction. There is no witness who saw the second painting burned. There is simply the long absence of the painting from every subsequent inventory of the Chartwell collection, and the silence of every member of the family who has ever been asked. The painting may have been destroyed in 1956. It may have been destroyed in 1965. It may, in some private and entirely sealed corner of the family papers, still exist. The evidence will not finally settle the question. What did, finally, settle the question of the affair itself was the long tape recording that John Colville made for Lady Mary Soames at his home in 1985, in the last year of his life. Colville had been one of Churchill's 2 principal private secretaries. He had known Churchill, his marriage, his moods, and his women, at very close quarters from 1939 onwards. He had been told, in 1953, by Churchill himself, in a long, candid evening conversation at Chartwell, that the affair with Lady Castlerosse had taken place in the south of France between 1933 and 1935, and that the buyback of the letters in 1938 had been at his own personal cost. Colville recorded the conversation, in summary, in a private memorandum at the time. He revisited it, on tape, with Lady Mary in 1985. The tape was deposited, sealed, in the Churchill Archives Centre at Churchill College, Cambridge. It was opened by the historians Richard Toy and Warren Doctor in the autumn of 2017. Their findings were published in March of 2018 and reported in Britain and across the world the same week. The defenders of the marriage have argued since then that the affair, even if it occurred, was a small thing in a long and otherwise faithful partnership. The argument is fair. The defenders have argued also that the affair was over by the autumn of 1935, that Clementine never spoke of it, and that the marriage continued for 30 further years without serious breach. That argument is also fair. The point of this video is not to overturn the marriage. The point is to recover the woman. Doris Delevingne, the haberdasher's daughter from Streatham, the most photographed Englishwoman of her generation, the muse of Cecil Beaton, the tenant of the Palazzo Venier de Leoni, the secret lover of the most consequential British politician of the 20th century, died alone in a small suite at the Dorchester Hotel on the 12th of December 1942, at the age of 42, at a time when the man whose letters she had once kept in a small leather case had 372 more days to wait before the tide of the war would finally turn his way at El Alamein. She had brought him home, in a sense, more than once. She had given him a summer on a yacht in the Western Mediterranean. She had given him a letter in which he called her a ray of sunshine. She had asked, in the end, for £1,000 and a polite handshake, and she had taken the handshake and turned, and walked back into a life that the war and her own bad luck would close down on her within 4 years. He could not save her. He did not, in any case, try. The grand house in this story is not Chartwell. The grand house in this story is not the Palazzo Venier de Leoni. The grand house in this story is Doris herself, the long, white, beautifully lit interior of a woman who had set out from Streatham Hill in 1920, with a small trunk and a clear-eyed calculation, and who had, by the careful expenditure of her own beauty over 20 years, built herself into one of the most photographed rooms in Europe. The slow work of family loyalty by his wife, by his friends, by his archive, and by the white walls of Chartwell itself has taken her down to one painting and a label. The label says her name. The label says nothing else. The slow, decent, devastating logic of that erasure is the lesson of her life, and it is a lesson that, 80 years after the chambermaid found her in the small, low-floor suite at the Dorchester, the official histories are still not quite ready to write. If you stayed with me to the end, take a moment to subscribe so the next of these does not pass you by. I would also like to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? And do you believe Clementine Churchill burned that second painting? Or do you think it still survives in a private corner of the family papers?